Every legend has an enemy hidden in the shadows, and for James Bond, that enemy now has a name. The Crimson Veil, a secret organization so ruthless that even MI6 kept its existence buried from the world. Bond's new mission appears simple on paper: trace a series of disappearances connected with illegal bioweapons research. But the moment he steps into the investigation, he realizes this is no ordinary assignment. Every clue drags him deeper into a labyrinth where assassins move like ghosts, enemies strike without leaving a trace, and the Crimson Veil's leader, a man whispered about in intelligence circles, is said to be more dangerous than any villain Bond has ever faced. Soon, Bond finds himself trapped in a deadly game, ambushed inside an abandoned research facility, hunted through narrow corridors, and forced into brutal hand-to-hand combat with mercenaries trained to kill without hesitation. And when he finally comes face to face with the mastermind, he understands one terrifying truth. This enemy doesn't just want power, he wants total control. But how will Bond survive the traps laid for him? How will he outsmart a villain who is always 10 steps ahead? And what horrifying secret is hidden behind the Crimson Veil? All of this, the secrets, the dangers, the enemies hiding behind the Crimson Veil, you will uncover only when you step into the first chapter of this story. The motorway cut a black seam through the sleeping countryside. James Bond eased the Aston into the soft halo of a service area and killed the engine more out of habit than need. A charity gala in the evening, an exhausted but obligatory smile at a table, then the long drive back to London, the kind of night that leaves a man alert in stretches where other men drift. He wanted coffee, something hot and quick, the ordinary ritual of an ordinary life. He wanted it because routines keep ghosts at bay. The lights of the forecourt were thin, sodium bright, and half-broken. A vending machine hummed like a small animal. Traversing the patch of concrete, Bond noticed her before he registered her features. The slight figure under a pale lamp, the way she kept folding and unfolding her hands as if counting away panic. She stood in front of the small glass observation lift that serviced the kiosk and toilets, a cheap unit with a jammed button. The rest area otherwise belonged to the night. Empty pumps, a single maintenance van with its lights off, a distant lorry idling. Bond crossed the lot. "Are you all right?" he asked, because there are habits older than curiosity. She looked up. Wet hair stuck to the side of her face. Eyes that didn't quite settle. She tried to breathe the words. She said a name that didn't land, then a small, hollow nod. When she said it again, it sounded like an afterthought. "Layla." The lift button did nothing. She pressed. Nothing. The glass of the lift reflected a face that was almost blank. Bond knew the look, the blink of disorientation that follows a seizure, or a blow, or some invisible rot inside a person's head. He made a decision in the time it takes to light a cigarette and then not smoke it. He opened the Aston's passenger door. "Sit," he said. The heater came alive. Breath fogged the glass. She climbed in like a person half dreaming, her legs uncertain, her fingers cold. Bond ran a quick field assessment. Habit, muscle, a life lived in small checks. Vitals seemed plausible. He took a cheap diagnostic from the glove box, a Q prototype used for field triage, and it returned ordinary numbers. Heart rate a touch raised, blood pressure steady, sugars unremarkable. His tools offered nothing. His eyes did. She repeated phrases, small fragments that slid out and then disappeared. A month, a street name, a fragment of melody. Her hands trembled. Once she reached for something that wasn't there and then startled as if she'd been snapped awake. "It's only an hour to the hospital," Bond said. "Hold on to that name for me. I'll ride with you." He drove with a focus that sharpened as the clinical alarm in him rose. At the hospital reception he arranged for triage. Medical staff moved fast and professional. Layla was taken inside. Bond relayed what he'd seen in one clipped sentence to the neurologist on duty. EEG. Imaging now. No external trauma. The doctor shook his head. We'll run scans. No obvious toxin markers on entry. We'll keep her monitored. But the watch told a different tale. Over the next 2 hours, Layla's condition bled into a slower, invisible decline. She became less coherent at the edges. Not simply confused, but occasionally blank, like a place where a sentence had been cut from a page. The EEG showed curious microsynchronizations across the hippocampal traces, tiny, rhythmic bursts that did not correspond to familiar seizure patterns. The neurologist spoke in professional worry. These are entrainment spikes. The pattern is atypical, suggestive of an external modulating signal. We're not seeing ordinary toxins. We're not seeing ordinary causes. Bond's training made him cautious by temperament and furious by nature. This was not a random crime. It looked like laboratory-level intervention. He emailed M a single line, unexplained neuroentrainment. Lab at rest area. Discreet handle. The reply came, approach with care. 007. He left the hospital without sleeping and drove back to the service area. He wanted to know 2 things, exactly where he'd met the girl, and whether anyone, camera, witness, device, could place the moment in time. He was not surprised to find the obvious camera missing. What did surprise him was the telltale edge under the camera housing, a hairline seam, a hidden cut. He pressed a thumb where no ordinary hand would press and felt a soft click. A small panel slid. A hatch, a rusted ladder, and cold metal smell that rose from a stair into a dark beneath the forecourt. Bond slid down into the shadow. The room was a ruin of method. It had been a laboratory once. Stainless steel benches, the ghost of laminar hoods, a shelf of extinguished fume cupboards. Instruments lay as if someone had turned from them and never returned. Tipped racks, a smashed vial whose label was charred and unreadable, a smear on a bench where something had been wiped away in a haste that was almost ceremonial. There were scorch marks and traces of something fine on the surface, a grid-like particulate that under a loupe looked manufactured, regular at a scale you don't find in nature. He took samples with gloved hands. He wrapped them and vac-sealed them for Q-Branch. He called Zara and sent for a small forensic team. Q's lab would want these shards. Forensics would want to sweep for other signatures. He felt the cold clinical pleasure of a man who loved patterns. The particles hinted at tiny mechanisms, a lattice not of molecules alone but of engineered structure. Bond did not name it. He did not have to. Tech like that exists on the side of the ledger where institutions sign secrecy agreements. By the time Bond left the hatch, the night was thinning into a colorless dawn. He drove back to the hospital to check on Layla. The neurologist's face was harder. She's stable but deteriorating, he said. We can't find anything in the blood work. No toxins. No infection markers. We're running broader panels. Bond listened, controlled, and then asked another question. Any CCTV from the hospital entrance? A nurse swallowed. A man was seen loitering near the main door, no ID, left before staff could confront him. Bond's jaw tightened. The call he made at 2 in the morning went to Imran. The man was, by reputation and by Bond's personal ledger of favors, a whisper at the seam of legitimate research and black market application. Imran replied in the only language he ever used for danger. Hints. Helion, he said, and one name can open doors. Old nano delivery patent. Shell funding. Offshore payrolls tied to a clinical subcontractor in the Maghreb. If you want a human lead, look for Farouk, Istanbul Circuit. If there is a lab network, Helion ghosted it across nodes, clinical MRIs, minor research hospitals, decommissioned pharmacites. Helion. The name had floated across industry journals once, a white paper on targeted micro-delivery vectors that promised therapeutic miracles. Then the paper ceased and the company simply vanished. The signature on that paper could be mimicked. It could also be an actual finger left by someone who once worked at a respectable lab and then stepped into shadow work for money or ideology. Bond had seen both. He sent Layla's sealed samples under weight and secrecy to Q-Branch. He had his men sweep CCTV footage from motorway junctions and nearby hotels. He quietly ordered hospital security to increase watchfulness. When the nurse came back with news, it was worse. Overnight, an unknown man in a surgical cap and an official-looking jacket had entered Layla's ward pretending to be a transfer escort. He had been challenged, and in the scuffle a single brief camera capture showed him carrying Layla out of the hospital in a wheelchair. Security footage cut out 2 minutes later. By dawn he and his team had a horrifying confirmation. Layla had been abducted and taken from the hospital. Surgical cap, paperwork forged, a van that left on a secondary exit recorded by a traffic camera. It was efficient. It was not improvisational. It smelled of organization. Bond felt the small knot of satisfaction that belongs to a man who has just been given confirmation that his instincts were not paranoid. Then he felt the larger, colder knot. The organization that had engineered something was active, capable, and bold enough to abduct a patient from a hospital. They were not just testing, they were moving product and people. Back at the ruined lab, the forensics team worked up a preliminary analysis. Manufactured particulates, surface residue indicating a carrier medium, trace markers that aligned with advanced delivery vectors, language enough to tell a trained eye that this was not a street chemist and not a lone enthusiast. Q's contacts would run patterns on procurement, supplier invoices, component serials. Shell accounts would be peeled like an onion. Imran provided a second thread before the morning was done, a name in the financial trail, payments moving through a Mediterranean shell corporation with registration that pointed at a set of clinics linked historically to a company with a Helion report 10 years old. Bond set the plan in motion with the clarity of a man assembling chess pieces. Layla would be priority 1. Find traces, follow the van, pressure the traffic cams and tolls, get the vehicle's route. Farouk in Istanbul might be a human lead or a dead end. Still, the pattern suggested a North Africa/Eastern Mediterranean circuit and Bond would follow it. He stalled public knowledge. M wanted discretion. The fewer people who knew, the fewer could be compromised. At mid-morning the first brittle communique arrived from hospital security. The van's plates had been spotted on a ferry manifest leaving the southern coast. Layla was already being moved out of the country. Bond closed his fist once, slow and controlled. The fabric of this conspiracy was starting to reveal itself in threads. A vanished company, a ruined lab under a rest area, a patient taken for medical care, and a human network that used legitimate clinical routes as a cover for trafficking. The only name he had was Helion, the only human thread Imran's Farouk. He tapped his earpiece. Zara. Q is on the samples. Forensic sweep is on. Imran's lead is active. Trace the ferry manifests and port exits now. If they moved her through legitimate channels, we'll find the slip. If they used a shell ship, follow the line and I'll meet you in Istanbul. Zara's reply was immediate and tight. On it. And 007, watch your back. Bond looked through the windscreen at the motorway, at the faint line of dawn. He had picked up one life at a rest stop and been brought to the edge of something that could, if he did not stop it, affect far more than one woman. He had a hunch when he followed Larson's work once. Small things bloom into contagion. He did not yet know what the contagion would be, only that its architects were patient, clever, and murderous. He set the Aston into gear and drove toward the city. He had a name, a map, and a promise of violence unspooling. The hunt had a first scent. The first light in the hospital was thin as tissue. The ward smelled of antiseptic and printer toner. Bond sat where fluorescent bulbs made everyone look a little older, his hand closed over the paper cup of coffee until it creased. He watched Layla breathe through the pause of monitors, shallow, stubborn inhales that somehow sounded too small for a body that had wanted to live. Every so often her fingers twitched, as if fighting a rhythm only she could hear. The neurologist came back with the same cautious face. "EEG still showing entrainment spikes," he said. "We're running full spectral analysis, but," he stopped. The sentence left as a gap. "It behaves like a modulated input. Not a known seizure pattern. Not a classic intoxication. We thought perhaps an exogenous electromagnetic influence, but the scans do not support that." Bond folded his hands. "Nano delivery?" he asked. The doctor blinked and then made a small, helpless gesture. He did not say the word because in hospitals they are careful with things that might lead to panic or malpractice suits. Bond texted the sealed samples he'd taken from the rest stop lab. He sent them with Q's chain of custody and a note, Priority Alpha. Code name Helion. Q's reply came in his idiosyncratic way, a single gif of a microscope and the words, "I have the gloves on." He did not linger. The security footage of the hospital corridor had already been pulled and analyzed. Bond watched the single grainy frame where a man in a surgical cap steered Layla out on a wheelchair, paperwork tucked under his arm. There was no face, only the pale oval of the cap and a gloved hand on a blanket. The van's registration, when it appeared on the feed, was old paper. A ferry manifest had recorded it passing through a southern port 2 hours after the capture. "He's moved fast," Bond observed aloud to Zara over the secure line. "Professional extraction. Not amateurs." "Professional and discreet," Zara corrected. "Means planning and resources. Also, he wasn't rushed. He wanted that patient calm." Bond's mind felt like one of the cogged machines Q sometimes fondly described. Run the input, watch the outputs, adjust calibrations. He pushed his chair back and moved. There was a restlessness in him that had nothing to do with the hunt, and everything to do with the girl's empty chair. The rest stop cellar needed detail. Forensics had dusted, swabbed, and catalogued, but the laboratory's ruin told a story only someone with field experience could read. The scorched vial with the charred label had held a carrier medium, not biological in the old-fashioned sense but an engineered lattice meant to protect and deliver. Under magnification the particles showed a repeating architecture, lattices at submicron scale that suggested a non-traditional assembly, a hybrid of organic capsid and manufactured scaffolding. "Nanobot?" asked the lead tech, whose name Bond now knew, Henderson. He was 50 and had a face that had given up trying to be surprised by anything. Henderson did not like the word. He refrained. "A delivery vector. Could be colloidal. Could be rare polymer. Whatever it is, it's not from any sanctioned supplier." It fit Helion's old promise, targeted micro-delivery, a company that had once written about precision medicine and then quietly disappeared from public registers. If the device had been adapted into something malicious, a vector that could encode a neuromodulating pulse into a human host, then the entrainment spikes on Layla's EEG were no accident. They were the fingerprint of an architecture designed to hijack neuronal synchrony. Bond felt the narrative close around him like water. He made the calls Imran had suggested. Farouk in Istanbul was, as Imran suggested, the right man to ask about shipments and shell companies. His answer, when he finally reached him, was a syllable of confirmation and a hint. "There are clinical couriers who move product nightly," Farouk said. "They have documents. Sometimes those documents come from legitimate clinics, for a transfer, an MRI follow-up, a charity bed. People who want to hide use the seams. Bond traced the ferry, the van, the courier manifests, and every thread concluded in plausible deniability until a tiny bureaucratic error glinted through, a customs clerk who had scribbled the van's origin with the wrong ink. It was a thin seam, but Bond had always trusted clerical mistakes. That ink matched a small logistics company registered in Prague. The company appeared, on paper, to ship medical disposables. In reality, it parceled out more complicated things to the edges of research. Imran's contact there, a woman named Valeska Cord, was slender in rumor and fat in caution. She had former associations in legitimate equipment supply and a history of moving specialized parts with zero moral questions. On paper she was a vendor. In whispered registers she was a gatekeeper. Bond did what he always did when a foreign node was involved. He gathered the smallest, most reliable people who could move quietly across borders. The Aston stayed in London. Bond took the night flight to Prague with 2 trusted men, a forensics lead and a small Q-branch courier carrying the samples and instructions. Prague smelled of river and old stone. At night the city hides in itself like something that does not want to be touched. Valeska's premises were unremarkable, a warehouse in the industrial quarter, bland signage, a discreet loading bay. On arrival, Bond found the front desk manned by a receptionist who spoke 3 languages and smiled like someone who had practiced grief. She denied knowledge. The ledger was neat. The invoices were clean. The corporate website promised supply solutions for research groups. But shadows do not vanish easily once you begin to look for their seams. Bond's forensics team swept the loading bay and found welded bolts and a delivery crate whose serial plates had been re-stamped. The crate contained, among sterile wraps and disposable filters, a battered hard casing that, when opened, contained a portable incubator and a roster of encrypted drives. One drive, when imaged, yielded a fragment, a lab notebook page with a header, Project Veil, and a stamped laboratory schematic bearing an emblem Bond's memory had already registered in shards, a stylized veil in crimson. He thought of Layla. He thought of the entrainment spikes. He thought of the small lattice particles he had photographed under Q's loop. The pieces were aligning into a pattern that suggested deliberate architecture, a lab network, a delivery vector, tests on humans. Bond did not expect cooperation. He expected evasions. He expected lawyers. He had both. He took a different route: leverage. Imran produced the name of a technician who had once worked for a contractor supplying Helionera projects. A man who would talk if bribed and would do so more quietly if old loyalties tugged his conscience. They found him in a narrow cafe off Wenceslas Square, sleeves rolled, hands that trembled only when he sipped coffee. He confessed bits, subcontracted clean rooms, off-contract clinical trials in North Africa, a courier route that moved samples under the guise of clinical research. What was Project Veil? Bond asked. The man's face went pale. They called it a neuromodulator, a delivery system. They said it could cure epilepsy if you had the right patient. But they also said it could be tuned. They told us the math was elegant. They paid decent. Then people disappeared. Bond felt the edges of anger sharpen. Who paid? The technician named names that were, as Imran had warned, thin as water on a fingerprint. Shell accounts, charitable foundations that funded clinical pilot studies and then vanished. He mentioned a patron, a private donor with interests in defense contracting and a philanthropic front that built clinics in the Maghreb. The donor's identity was not complete, but it was enough to anchor a theory. Someone with money, access to legitimate medical channels, and an appetite for unregulated experimentation. When Bond pushed official channels, Interpol, Europol, partnering national agencies, he found polite bureaucracy and guarded silence. The dossier on Helion, where it existed, was half-redacted and heavily coded. No single publicly accountable agency had a full picture. Information was dispersed into a geography of plausible deniability. Private contractors, outsourced trials in jurisdictions with lax oversight, and philanthropic fronts that obscured payments through tax-sheltered charities. He tried selling the story, not for money but for traction, to institutions that could compel cooperation. Each door closed with a professional shrug. It was the shape of modern secrecy, so many hands that no one could grasp the whole. Bond realized something disquieting. The organization behind Project Veil had engineered invisibility into the way it traded. Not just physical concealment, but bureaucratic camouflage, a ledger that smiled. The breakthrough came when Q's imaging lab returned an augment. The particle lattice was, indeed, a manufactured scaffold. More than that, Q's specialists had unraveled a signal embedded in the residue, a low-energy modulation pattern that could, in principle, bias synaptic synchrony if delivered in precise dosage. Q did not indulge speculation. He forwarded a single phrase: programmable neuromodulatory payloads. In plain English, a serum that carried a synthetic scaffold capable of aligning neuronal firing, enough to cause precision behavioral or cognitive effects when correctly targeted. It was not only moral horror, it was tactical potential. Bond's options narrowed. Whoever ran Project Veil had facilities sophisticated enough to synthesize engineered polymer scaffolds and to load them with neuromodulatory payloads. They also had the audacity to abduct patients mid-treatment. They were not amateur criminals. They were an organized scientific crime network that mixed legitimate outputs with clandestine aims. He returned to London and found the ward emptier than he expected, a single curtain drawn, a nursing shift changed. The indent on the mattress where Layla had once lain was a small ghost. Bond's hand tightened around the guardrail like someone keeping a promise. "Yes," said the nurse who met him in the corridor. "They took her." Bond's throat closed for half a breath. He had felt it coming. He had known the night would breed another cold certainty. "Any sign?" he asked. "Only this," the nurse replied, and she held out a scrap of paper with a telephone number and a single penciled word: Valeska. The name confirmed what he had already found in Prague. The trace led back to the same nexus. But now the network had a face, a gatekeeper who sold equipment and, perhaps more importantly, provided cover. Bond reassembled his small circle. M approved an operation that was, in all frankness, too delicately political for aggressive action. Discreet inquiries, tailing, pressure on the financiers. Q fashioned a portable spectrum analyzer and a discrete jammer for the sort of low-energy signals Q suspected might be used for remote entrainment. It looked like a cigarette case but hummed like a small weather system. Zara coordinated channels at the hospital to ensure every exit and entrance was watched. Imran, as always, found people who knew where the best shadows lived. They moved with professional patience. Bond watched meetings and dossiers, tracked payments disguised as humanitarian donations, and pulled at the threads until a seam opened, a foundation called the Crescent Trust, an ostensibly philanthropic vehicle that funded clinics and paid for research collaboration in North Africa and the Near East. When Bond dug into its trustees, he found a trail that led to a private defense contractor known for producing drones and encrypted comms. It was an uncomfortable liaison. Men who sold death in hardware who might also fund a laboratory for a promise of psychological control. He made the mistake of going on the offensive, not forensically but personally. He sent an encrypted note to one of the contractor's lower-level project managers asking for clarification. The reply was a courteous non-denial: "We do not deal in human experiments." It was the language of men who both lied and believed their lies. The lab trace in England, however, had intersected with another lead. At the industrial estate Bond had raided, the inner sanctum had been swept clean but not perfectly. Under a false floorboard he found a layered envelope with payment slips, travel itineraries, and a stamped itinerary for a courier who had moved between London, Marseille, and Tangier. The courier's manifest listed several patient transfers for follow-up imaging and one odd notation, code V. The V matched the crimson veil stamp Bond had seen in Prague. The international pattern was clear now. Clinical fronts in North Africa and Eastern Europe, shipments routed through shadow logistics, experiments performed in private lab suites paid for by charitable donations that were, in truth, clean money for dirty experiments. The aim? That question hung like a question mark, heavy with possibility. Behavioral modification? Political manipulation? Military applications? All of the above, perhaps. Bond knew what had been done to Layla could be scaled. A neuromodulatory payload distributed in a deniable way across populations, in a clinic, in a charity, in a refugee camp, could be a weapon that left no conventional signature. Who would build such a thing and why? The answer was a corridor of men and women with ambition and an absence of moral brakes. He pressed harder. He went to an agency that specialized in tracking charitable donations. The man there, a senior analyst, slid a manila folder across the table and let it fall open in a way that suggested resignation. "We've seen this pattern," he said. "Not identical, but close. It's the old Helion signature, hybrid biological scaffolds, outsourced clinical testing, and an institutional shell. Usually, it fizzles. Money dries up. But the Crescent Trust doesn't fizzle. They have deep pockets and plausible graves." Bond read the pages: donors, beneficiaries, transfers. There was a name he did not expect, a private financier whose holdings included a discreet urban redevelopment portfolio and a foundation that had built a children's hospital in Tangier. The financier preferred philanthropy as a public face. In private, he had other appetites. Bond had to be careful. The financier's public profile meant political fallout if he pursued a hard case without ironclad evidence. He would not be the first man to see a career cut by pursuing the wrong kind of truth. Still, Layla's face haunted him. He could taste the copper edge of urgency. He moved without ceremony, a midnight knock at a solicitor's door, a conversation over stale sandwiches with an archivist who handled the trust's files, a photograph smuggled from the back office of a clinic in Tangier that showed a logo, understated, on the wall behind an administrator. Q ran image analysis. The logo matched components on the lab ledger's header. It came together as most ugly truths do, not clean and not sudden, but threaded through ordinariness. Helionera technology had been refinanced by a series of private patrons. They had built a network using clinics as covers and courier companies as veins. The people who ran the labs were scientists rather than monsters by temperament. They were men who liked elegant equations and had sold their ethics in attrition. They used plausible medical reasons to obtain patient consent or, when convenient, to obtain no consent at all. When Bond finally forced a small, legitimate clinic in Tangier to cooperate, not by subpoena but by the careful application of truth and insinuation, they produced a ledger that made his stomach knot. There were names of volunteers, payments that promised treatment, and one chilling line: Phase 2, Cognitive Calibration. Beneath it, a note: target parameters not to exceed 0.3 Hz entrainment. It was clinical language sharpened into a weapon. He had to act. Not with grand displays, M would not authorize that, but with precision. Bond planned a small incursion, a covert entry into a satellite lab that had been flagged as a research annex by a courier manifest. The annex sat behind an innocuous storefront on an industrial row, a facade selling agricultural machinery. Behind it were cold rooms and a modest staff who believed they were doing honest work. The operation moved at dawn. Bond, Imran, and a small MI6 unit slipped through delivery entrances and into the annex. It was not the fortress he had feared. It was comfortingly ordinary, which made it worse. Refrigerated racks hummed, notebooks lay open, and on a cold laminate bench a tablet displayed a neural synchrony chart with faint echoes of the entrainment pattern Bond had seen on Layla's EEG. Then the alarms sang. He had expected them. He had planned for them. But he had not planned for the speed of the response. Men in regulation-issue jackets, faces masked by professional calm, and behind them the unmistakable authority of corporate security with effective hardware. Bond ducked into a corridor and felt a bullet graze plaster near his head. The sound a poor imitation of thunder that made his spine simper. The fight was close, mechanical and human. Bond moved like a man who had learned to turn physics into fury. He neutralized one attacker with a throw that taught an elbow bone to give up its claim on another man's jaw. Another lunged and Bond used the man's momentum to knock him into a server rack. Imran, all quick hands and quicker smile, removed two men with the sort of improvised brutality learned in another city and at another cost. They reached the inner lab and found incubators humming with small canisters and, in a sealed cabinet, documents with patient identifiers and encoded transfers. A man in a suit who clearly had been waiting for them spoke without surprise. "You're persistent, Mr. Bond," he said. His voice was modulated by education and a light that suggested he had never learned to be afraid. Bond did not answer. He moved first, fast. The man reached for something, a small pistol, and Bond's hand caught it at the edge of the draw. They grappled. The man smelled of citrus and refined tobacco. "You don't have to make this," the man began. Bond bit out one syllable. "Who funds you?" The man smirked. "We're funded by people who prefer to remain private. Philanthropy with terms. We cure problems the public can't be trusted to understand." "What problems?" Bond demanded. "One's place in the world is shaped by what one can afford to own," the man said, with a calm that made Bond's blood run cold. "Control is expensive, Mr. Bond. We help those with fear to manage it." It was a grotesque philosophy wrapped in the language of elites. Bond's reply was not rhetorical. He beat the answer out of the man. Not because the man deserved agony, but because the ledger demanded names. Under pressure, under the right mixture of pain and the threat of truth, the man gave a list: a financier with holdings in redevelopment, an institutional client in the private security sector, and a string of lab managers who rotated through the system like interchangeable instruments. It was not everything Bond needed. It was enough. By the time the raid finished, the annex was in partial ruin. Men lay gagged, drives were snapped and smuggled, evidence was catalogued. Q's men secured samples. The small victory tasted like bittersweet coffee. They had uncovered a node, seized documents that tied Project Veil to a chain of patrons, and yet the patrons themselves remained ghosts in suits. Bond returned to London with a crate of new questions and a single tangible thing: a telephone number scrawled in the annex manager's notebook alongside the initials CT, the Crescent Trust. He placed a call through channels that would not track back to his desk and heard, on the other end, a voice smooth as the veneer on an expensive table agreeing to meet. "We should talk about philanthropy, Mr. Bond. Over dinner. Bring your facts." He expected the ambush. He planned for it. But he did not plan for the graceful cruelty of patronage. Men who can buy silence like perfume. The Crescent Trust's representative arrived with a retinue and a smile. Their public face was impeccable. Their private language was surgical. "You are meddlesome," the representative told Bond across a table set with linen and small candles. "We are doctors and patrons. We fund cures. You fund secrecy and experiments on unconsenting people," Bond replied. The conversation was a dance: insinuation, threat, legal seduction. The representative refused to speak plainly. When Bond placed the annex documents on the table, the man's face did not change. "We cannot be responsible for the misdeeds of contractors," he answered. "If there is wrongdoing, it will be dealt with." Bond walked out with no arrests and a broader net. He had rattled the protective cage enough to show teeth, but he had not forced predators into the open. He was, as he often had to be, a patient predator himself. Back in his flat, he finally allowed himself a moment to sit and think. Layla's name sat on a post-it on his desk like a legal summons. He pinched it and felt the paper snap. He had managed to force one small node to reveal itself. He had compelled a contractor's man to cough up names. He had, with Imran's help, uncovered the skeletal architecture of a project that married biotech ingenuity to the appetite of men who preferred their sins garnished with philanthropy. But the real problem remained: the serum, the scaffold, the programmable neuromodulation. These were not toys. They were weapons in the hands of patients who see control as salvation, and in the hands of men who see influence as profit. Q's message arrived at 2 in the morning. "We have partial sequencing on carrier. It's novel but traceable. There is a manufacturing signature in the polymer backbone. A lab in Eastern Europe used a proprietary crosslinker. I can track the order history, but only if we use certain financial levers. Also, Layla's last hospital had a strange notation on intake, an implanted microtransponder. Someone wasn't just delivering a payload, they were seeding a tag." Bond considered that. A transponder could be a tracking device, a triggering mechanism, or part of the delivery architecture itself. It could also be how the abductors monitored treatment compliance. "You found a tag?" he asked, out loud, though only his shadow answered. Q's next line was delivered with an economy that was almost affection. "Yes. And it's field programmable. We can ping it, but it's encrypted to a protocol Q doesn't like. It smells of military contracts. If you want names, dig the defense holdings. If you want to stop it, destroy the network. But that's pretty theatrical, old chap." Bond smiled without humor. He had never been one to choose theater over precision, but he also knew that when institutions colluded with corruption, sometimes a public theatrical act was the only way to expose the rot beneath. He made a choice he would not later regret nor find easy. He would follow the transponder. No more patient anonymity. No more polite conservatism. Layla was a life. He would trace the device and find the people who used it. It led him, in fragments and in rage, to another small clinic, this one with ties to a private contractor, a ledger that tied back to the Crescent Trust, and a manager who had once been an officer in a state security service. When Bond arrived, the clinic was cold and empty, save for a single nurse who looked like she had accepted too many compromises for too little money. "You don't know what you're touching," she told him in a voice that had quit on itself. "They tell us they're doing good. They tell us we're part of a cure. Then they fit them with chips and we ship them out." "Where did they go?" Bond asked. "To the south. To clinics that don't ask questions. To donors who love to see their names on plaques," she said. She named towns that were thin on maps and heavy with poverty. "They think charity means being able to try anything on the poor." Bond clenched his teeth until his jaw worked. The outrage would be useful. It would be fuel. But he could not let it rule him into mistakes. He planned a quieter route, the tracker ping first, then the siege. He would find Layla. He would find the donors. And he would find the laboratory that could turn a microscopic lattice into a doctrine of control. When the gadget Q left him to test, the transponder cut the network and flashed a single coordinate, Bond recognized the geometry of a small fixer's farmhouse not far from a cargo route, a place where deliveries were accepted, packages moved, and transponders could be reprogrammed. He did not tell him everything. He did not tell Imran everything either. He told himself only that he was going in with the smallest team he could trust. He took the Aston one last time down a motorway he had already measured in the dark. The farmhouse sat in a ring of brush like an old tooth. It had been renovated tastefully, the kind of place someone with money but no conscience picks to be discreet. Bond watched from the hedgerow as men in plain jackets unloaded crates. There was no grand show of force, only professionals carrying out a delivery with the efficiency of men who never wanted to be seen. He moved in. The door answered his shoulder. Inside, a basement of cold rooms connected by a corridor of servers and centrifuges, everything set up for a small, surgical set of experiments. There were vials, recent graffiti on the whiteboard with chemical shorthand, and, near a bank of incubators, a hospital blanket folded with a care that suggested someone who still kept the human in mind. Layla's name was on a file. That file led to patient charts, anonymized crude medical records annotated with a shorthand code, CV-017, response profile, partial entrainment, recommended recalibration. It was clinical language that read like an admission of guilt. He was not alone in the room long. A door banged. Men flowed down the stairs, trained, fast, and with professional guns in hand. The fight this time was not the messy, improvised scuffle of the annex. It was surgical, practiced. Bond moved like a man used to being both hunter and prey, striking with calibrated violence, disabling men who had been bought on principle. He reached the inner incubator and found Layla. On a bed, eyes fluttering, a single wire tracing to a small band at her nape, the transponder. He cut the connection with the tool cue had slipped him and felt Layla reel as if she had been snatched from a current. Her eyes cleared for an instant, and in that instant she looked at Bond like a woman who had recognized a hand offering freedom. "Layla," he said softly, "we're getting you out of here." She tried to speak. The sound that came out was husky and small. "They told me it was for my head," she managed. "It's different. It makes me hear things." Bond's chest tightened. The word "here" and the pattern of entrainment fit together like two halves of a coin. You could control how someone listened, you could tune them to obey. It was a weapon that could be implanted in trust. He lifted Layla into his arms as the basement filled with alarms. On the stair, masked men converged. Bond moved like wind. He found the small back exit, the Aston idling like an old friend, and drove like the road itself had been widened for the purpose of escape. He got her into a safe place, under the care of professionals who would not ask the wrong kinds of questions. He watched her sleep and, for once, let himself hope. Then he returned to the web of paper and names, colder and more certain than before. Project Veil was not a simple experiment. It was an industrialized system of control funded by men who expected to profit from power. Whoever had built it had thought deeply about plausible deniability. Whoever funded it had money and taste. Whoever ran it had patience. Bond had broken one small node and freed one patient. That was not enough. He poured himself a drink and stared at the city. There were many moving parts, financiers who would not speak, contractors who would excuse themselves with lawyers, labs that would shutter when the light touched them. He had to move differently now, with the kind of theater that could make men reveal themselves. His phone rang. M's name flashed on the secure line. He answered. "Well?" she asked. "It's bigger than a private experiment," he said. "It's an architecture." "Then make it fragile," she said. "Make them afraid of their own ledger." Bond hung up and began to write a list. names to confront, foundations to expose, dossiers to leak, and, when necessary, a public moment that might force an answer. He would tempt the predators with the one thing that could torture them more than a raid: exposure. Outside, the city glittered with 1,000 safe lies. Inside, the small labeling of Project Veil had begun to unravel. Bond had one patient in his care and a country of secrets to challenge. He set the Aston's alarm, folded a suit, and for the first time since the night at the rest stop, allowed himself to prepare for the theater. There would be more beds, more laboratories, and more men who believed themselves beyond consequence. He would need cunning, patience, and the friends who could turn shadows into light. Imran, Q, Zara, and a single stubborn conviction: people were not projects. They were not experiments to own. The Crimson Veil had been prized. What lay beneath it was not a tidy horror but an entire economy of it. And Bond, as he always did, would walk into the smoke and find the matches. The yacht rode the swell like a dark animal, a vacant silhouette in a black sea. Bond lay flat on his stomach at the edge, breath slow, the salt air tasting of metal and distant diesel. Farouk's map had been exact, an old fortress converted into a research compound, its outer walls studded with sensor towers and the geometry of paranoia. Bond checked the small instruments Q had slipped him: a spectrum sniffer that looked like a cigarette case, a compact monofilament garrote in a pen, a laser-etched pry bar the size of a thumbnail. He adjusted the night vision to a narrow spectrum, focused on movement rather than light, and slid into the water. Swimming at night is a lesson in modesty. The cold steals judgment, but Bond's training turned each breath into calculation. He kept low, moving under the swell, letting the island's silhouette swallow him. Approaching the jetty, he hugged the shadow of an anchored barge and waited for the rotation of the guard's patrol light to pass. Then he swam the final yards, pulling himself up with ease and slipping into the kelp-fingered dark beneath the pier. The first sensors were acoustic reeds, pressure sensors set into the concrete, listening for footfall patterns. Q's gadget mimicked the micro-pressure signature of a delivery cart and tricked the sensor into reporting a false idol. Bond moved like a whisper across the jetty, the soles of his boots damp and silent. Above, the compound's lights traced slow constellations. Below, machines hummed in the belly of the fortress. He reached the fence where the camera's cones nearly overlapped and paused. The camera mount was old, a discrete access panel, a wire trunked into a buried junction box. Bond worked a small foam-tipped injector, feeding the lens a slurry that fooled autofocus and created a blind bloom for exactly 90 seconds. 90 seconds in espionage is a small eternity. It is the heartbeat between murder and mercy. Bond scaled the wall. The courtyard smelled of chlorine and ozone. 2 guards at the gate argued softly about a late delivery. He moved like a predator with the grace of someone who has practiced being invisible for a living, a heel-first hook that unbalanced one guard, a neck lever that converted resistance into compliance. He let both lie where they fell, their breathing slow and even. No screaming. No witnesses who could name a face. The corridors swallowed sound. The fortress had been gutted inside and fitted with stainless steel and glass. It looked less like a medieval stronghold and more like a hospital built by men who did not believe in mercy. Bond checked thermal readings on the wall, rooms full of equipment, some humming at odd frequency. He took photographs with a tiny camera that recorded directly to an encrypted stick tucked in his boot. His path cut through a storage wing that smelled faintly of ethanol and varnish. A lone technician crossed the hall and caught a silhouette in peripheral vision. Bond reacted without thinking. A judo hip throw, Kazushi, a classic. He stepped in, gripped the man's lapel, shifted his weight, pulled the man over his hip and into a stunned heap. The throw was fluid, a line of motion he could recite in sleep. Off balance, pivot, hip contact, chest drop. The man hit the tiles with the polite resignation of someone who had been bested by the physics of motion. Bond moved deeper. He found the lab levels, a cathedral of stainless benches interrupted by centrifuges and incubators. Screens ran long strings of code and electrophysiological graphs that made the hair at the back of his neck rise. There were glass vials batched on racks. Each bore tiny printed codes that, when cross-referenced by his embedded reader, returned to Helion's old supply chain. He photographed notebooks, cataloged reagent lot numbers, and pocketed a file of encrypted printouts. Then the floor echoed with movement. A patrol team, booted and armed, moving with the measured timing of men trained to react to any threat with overwhelming force. Bond found a shallow vent, squeezed into the cramped metal space, and listened. Voices came in low and professional tones. Calibration at 0400. Recheck the entrainment parameters, one voice said. Sequence holds at 0.27 Hz. Increase amplitude by 3% next run, another answered. Bond's stomach contracted. The clinical language of calibration. They were not experimenting on animals. They were tuning the human brain like a radio. He slipped from the vent and moved down a service corridor where doors were protected by biometric locks. A guard rounded the corner and saw him. The fight that followed was a study in hard, quiet violence, Imran's kind of intimate brutality married to Bond's lethal efficiency. Bond did not engage like a thug. He read the man's center of gravity and used it against him. The guard struck. Bond parried with an inside forearm block, redirecting the strike into the guard's extended arm. He stepped to the side, caught the wrist, and with a single circular motion, an Aikido kotegaeshi, he twisted the attacker's elbow until it betrayed him. The guard crumpled, keening in a small, defeated sound. Bond used the man as cover, pushing him between him and the corridor to muffle shock sensors. The fight was short, like a sentence cut precisely. He inched toward the lab's heart, a small suite marked by a reinforced door and a keypad. Bond's fingers worked a micro-drill on the lock seal. He felt the numbers of time like someone listening to a metronome. He fed cues transceiver into the circuitry and, with the patience of a practiced thief, harvested a cached biometric token. The door sighed open. Beyond, the room was small but dense with intent. A bank of incubators lined one wall, each containing what looked like curled gels in vials, carrier matrices. A whiteboard bore handwriting in a careful, academic script, subject response profiles, CV series, and beneath it, a chart marked 0.27 Hz alongside a string of patient codes. There was also a tablet left on a rolling cart, its screen open to an audio log. Bond listened with headphones. A clipped voice recorded entries in a tone that was more scientist than villain. Subject CV017. Partial entrainment observed at baseline. Phase 2. Increase microcarrier amplitude. Subject displays auditory gating to programmed stimulus. Note: need to reduce peripheral interference. The voice paused, added a name. Dr. Corrin, Principal Investigator. Dr. Corrin. The name fit a face Bond had seen in a single photograph on the prog drive. Neat hair, sharp glasses, hands that refused to get dirty. He was not a monster in the pulp sense, but a technician of consequence. Elegant equations, moral surrender in increments. A boot scuffed the corridor. Bond moved to the dark with the lightness of an old predator. Dr. Corrin entered, flanked by two techs, his movements mild and irritable, the manner of someone whose conscience had been given up for results. He hummed a tune as he came, the kind of domestic habit that seems unfitting in a laboratory of cruelty. Bond's strike was surgical. He waited until Corrin bent to check a readout, then stepped into view. The first strike was a low palm to the solar plexus, a breath stealer. Corrin doubled, surprised into vulnerability. Bond followed with a knee to the convex of the ribs, a heel to the jaw, and then, using the man's momentary dazzle, a choke from the rear that used an opponent's own collar to compress the windpipe. It was imprinted movement, minimal force, maximal control. The techs rushed. Bond used the table edge as an improvised lever and executed a sweeping leg takedown that sent one tech slamming into the incubator array. Glass clinked. One of the vials cracked. A faint silver plume hissed. But Q's pre-mission readouts had assured him the exposure would not harm him in a single breath. He moved. The room became a choreography of pain and limbs until all three lay still. He bound hands with cable ties, removed their weapons, and photographed every screen and notebook. A file on Corin's tablet contained something more damning than formulas, an encrypted ledger of clients and payees, names of charitable fronts, and beside them, the initials CT, Crescent Trust. Bond felt old, unpleasant satisfaction and a new coldness. The Crescent Trust was not only a patron but an organizer. He also found coordinates, another lab node, this time closer to home, a refurbished manor on the English coast with private moorings and a staff roster that suggested a place for upper-class donors to watch experiments as if they were theater. Above the list of donors, a single line sent a shiver through him. Phase 3, Population Needlepoint. He pocketed the tablet, left the scene cleaner than he found it, and melted into the facility's guts. The return was not easy. Alarms began to tick like a watch that had awakened. He moved through maintenance tunnels with the calm of a man who had rehearsed escape 10,000 times. Yet on the final stair, at the hatch that would open to the quay, he encountered the woman who had haunted the prog files, Valeska Cord. She stood framed by the storm-blue light of the compound's exit, hair like a banner, face carefully unreadable. 2 corporate security men flanked her. She did not look surprised, only mildly inconvenienced, as if one might expect intruders like loose weather. "Mr. Bond," she said, voice even, almost amused. "We were hoping you'd visit. Your persistence is impressive. You run a clinical supply company that rents labs to people who think ethics are cursor text," Bond said. Valeska smiled with the economy of a woman who had learned to keep her teeth for business. "We provide services," she said. "We do not ask too many questions. The market requires discretion. You know what's being done here." "We know what our clients request," she corrected. "We are not responsible for every application." She stepped closer. Under her breath, a glint of a small transmitter, the kind used to trigger external security. Bond's hand moved like lightning, catching for the device. Metal met metal. A sharp report cracked through the stairwell. Automatic turrets were now sweeping the quay as if a predator had tripped a web. Bond had a choice in a breath: fight or flight. He danced between both. He shoved Valeska aside and vaulted the hatch, rolling onto the jetty as the turrets spat light behind him. Bullets found old stone with the hollow thump of failure. He dodged into the night and ran for the yacht he had left tethered in the dark. Men poured after him, voices harsh, commands shouted in clipped accents. The sea swallowed his sprint. He dove into the water, the cold pain a welcome old friend, and swam for the boat with the current at his back. Hands dragged at his heels. He kicked, surged, and reached the stern as men clambered down the slick side. Bond's fingers closed on the ladder, and he hauled himself aboard in one fluid motion, the boat lurching under his weight. He slapped the starter. The engine answered like a hungry animal. As the yacht receded into the black mouth of the night, Bond looked back. The compound receded, lights like wounded stars. On his lap lay Corin's tablet and a data stick with images of patient charts, donor lists, and a single phrase repeated in many places: needlepoint. He knew what it meant. The architects of Project Veil were not merely making an instrument of control. They were mapping how to use it at scale. the science of influence applied to populations. He had the names that tied the network to the Crescent Trust. He had a list of labs. He had a radio tag on Layla's transponder and a direction that led him home. But on the yacht's small console, an incoming secure ping blinked with a message that stopped the small engine's small sound in his chest. "We have your man. Now we have something you will want. Meet the Trust. 48 hours. Or the boy dies." The boy. Bond's hand went cold. He had not anticipated a human blackmail lever this sharp. He held the tablet, the coordinates and the names, and a new human cruelty that meant someone had weaponized not only science but leverage. He stared at the message until the horizon blurred. The sea had given him answers, but it had also given him a new, cruel choice. Part of the net he was pulling had glinted with the faces of men who could buy silence, and now they knew he had touched their work. They had reasserted their rule: "You may follow, but we will take what you love in return." Bond set the yacht's autopilot for the nearest safe harbor and closed his eyes for a single, impossible count. He had a list, he had friends who owed him favors, and he had one stubborn oath: he would not let victims become instruments. The crimson veil had been pried, but the hand that had raised it was heavy, and its grip tightened. Part 4 would have to be smarter, sharper, and unrelenting. Bond reached for his phone and thumbed a secure line. "Imran," he said, voice like gravel. "Prepare." The Mediterranean night had turned black as ink, and the yacht's engine whispered against the swell. Bond sat hunched over Corin's tablet, tracing connections between donor names, laboratory nodes, and encrypted files that hinted at the full scale of Helion's operations. The boy, their human lever, was an unexpected variable, and one that had the capacity to turn the operation from extraction to disaster. Imran's secure line pinged. Bond activated it, voice clipped. "I have a live situation. Helion's network is deeper than we anticipated. The Trust is in play. They've kidnapped a child." "Understood," came the reply. "I've pulled Farouk and 2 assets into position. You'll need eyes on every exit. Satellite coverage is limited, but we can use local maritime traffic to mask your approach. You have 48 hours. Bond exhaled slowly, scanning the tablet again. The Crescent Trust was not just a financier, they were an organization with the reach of a small state. Their assets included offshore compounds, legitimate clinics as cover, and a network of loyal enforcers trained in both combat and evasion. The stakes were no longer just Layla or the boy, it was the serum itself, and the future of its application. The plan was immediate. Bond would infiltrate the closest Helion facility on the English coast, a manor refurbished as a laboratory, complete with private moorings for clandestine shipment. He would need stealth, speed, and exact precision. The first approach was the water. The tide was high, the winds unpredictable. Bond moved the yacht into a cove, camouflaged by cliffs on either side. He donned a wetsuit and approached the shore, carrying only what was necessary: monofilament garrote, silenced pistol, and Q's compact electromagnetic disruptor. The manor came into view, ivy-strewn, fortified with high walls, motion sensors, and cameras. Guards patrolled in pairs, moving with predictable shifts. Bond observed, mapped, and rehearsed every step in his mind. Timing was critical, even a second too early, and the boy might be moved. He struck with precision. A guard at the gate went down silently with a forearm strike to the neck, pivot, and roll, a combination of Wing Chun blocks and Aikido leverage. Another approached. Bond intercepted with a knee strike to the solar plexus, lifting the man into a controlled throw over a hedge. Each motion was catalogued, calculated. Bond moved like a shadow through the night. Inside the manor, corridors smelled of antiseptic and varnish. Bond paused at the junction outside the main laboratory. 2 security men passed, one scanning the hall with infrared goggles, the other flipping through a tablet. Bond's hand swept the floor, a miniature smoke pellet from Q's kit, releasing a nanoscopic haze that reflected the infrared. The guards blinked, scanning, then moved on, oblivious. The laboratory was a small fortress within a fortress. Screens displayed live EEG readouts from subjects, some awake, some restrained. Vials contained the serum, clear liquid shimmering under cold LED light. Bond crouched behind a console, photographing files and taking notes. A monitor revealed the boy's location, a small holding room on the west wing, guarded by a single attentive man. Bond moved. He neutralized the guard with a pressure point strike, fingers against the carotid, a twist of leverage. The man slumped silently. The door clicked open. Inside, the boy was awake, eyes wide, heart racing. Bond whispered, "I'm here to get you out. Stay calm. No sudden moves." The boy nodded, trembling. Bond checked the room for traps. Nothing visible, but a subtle hum suggested motion sensors or microtransmitters. He removed the boy silently, moving backward into the corridor, alert for patrols. Then the first alarm. A distant buzz, rapid and electronic. Turrets moved along the walls, doors sealed automatically. Bond's mind raced. He pressed a small button on his wrist, a Q-modified EMP pulse. Lights flickered, turrets froze momentarily, just long enough for him to sprint with the boy toward the service exit. A fight erupted in the main hall. Bond faced 2 more security personnel. The fight was close quarters, martial arts pure and detailed, a spinning heel kick to one's ribs, a palm strike to the jaw, a sweep that dropped the second guard backward. Bond used their own momentum against them, flipping one into the other, then rolling to his feet. Each movement was precise, economical, deadly. He reached the outer wall, vaulted over it with the boy in his arms, and ran toward the cove. From the manor, lights swept, guards shouted, and a dog barked. Bond didn't look back. He reached the yacht, boarded, and fired the engine. The night swallowed him as the turrets behind him spat light and fire into the walls. Once safely offshore, he set the boy down. The child was shaken but unharmed. Bond exhaled, scanning the tablet again. Coordinates for further labs, the Crescent Trust's contact points, and encrypted logs that confirmed the serum was designed for population-level influence. The network was sophisticated, international, and ruthless. Imran's voice came through the secure line. "You've got them, but they'll know you touched the boy. Expect a countermeasure." Bond's lips curved slightly. "Let them try. I'm already 2 moves ahead." He looked out at the dark horizon. The first phase was complete, the boy rescued, the lab documented, Helion's immediate operations disrupted. But the trust was still out there, watching, patient, calculating. The crimson veil had been lifted, but the shadows behind it were far from spent. Bond checked the encrypted comms again. The game had only just begun. The dawn over the English Channel was muted, a gray wash across restless water. Bond sat in the small cabin of his yacht, the boy beside him quietly tracing patterns on the wood with trembling fingers. Layla was still missing, but her abduction had left threads. The Crescent Trust and Hellion were connected, and Bond now had a map, an internal network, laboratories, donors, and handlers. Imran's voice came on the secure line, sharp and precise. "Phase 2 is imminent. The Trust is preparing a gala tonight, private, elite, offshore manner. Most likely to showcase or move the next batch. Security will be maximal. You'll need infiltration and leverage. Layla may be there. Expect full armament and loyal enforcers." Bond's jaw tightened. He glanced at the tablet, donor lists, encrypted guest manifests, and security rotations glowed dimly under the soft cabin light. Every line of code, every name, every calculated movement pointed to a single reality. The gala was the heart of the operation, the hub from which Helion's influence spread. He prepared with surgical precision. A tailored tuxedo over combat-ready underlayers. Silenced Walther P99 tucked in the ankle holster, monofilament garrote and Q's miniature EMP devices in the cufflink compartment, and a concealed camera recorder embedded in a cuff watch. Every item double-checked, every contingency considered. By nightfall, the yacht approached the island manor. This time, Bond did not approach via water. He climbed a small cliff behind the property, the terrain rough, gravel loose. Cameras lined the walls, infrared beams crisscrossing the courtyard. Using the EMP pulse from Q, he created a staggered blackout that froze optics long enough to slip into the estate unseen. Inside, the gala was a polished facade of opulence. Crystal chandeliers, the low hum of string instruments, and well-dressed guests masked the undercurrent of lethal intent. Bond navigated through the crowd, noting body language, security guards' movements, and exits. Layla was there, seated at a side table, pale but unharmed. Bond observed her carefully. No visible symptoms yet, but micro-traces of the nanobot serum in her gestures, small flickers in her pupils. One careful nod to a waiter brought her water. Bond subtly injected a stabilizing nanoprotective from Q into the drink. Across the room, Valeska Cord and Dr. Corrin circulated among the guests, their expressions polite, calculating. Bond's eyes narrowed. They were both orchestrators, not mere assistants. Their movements were choreographed, measured, designed to intimidate without overt action. He slipped to a service stairwell, approaching the sublevels where the serum vault and lab were hidden. Guards were present, but Bond neutralized them with precision martial techniques. Palm strikes to pressure points, elbows to ribs, throws calculated to incapacitate without unnecessary noise. Every step mirrored Imran Series' choreography, a dance of control, skill, and lethal intent. The lab beneath the manor was immaculate. Polished steel, glass hoods, centrifuges spinning silently. Vials labeled CV series, incubators humming with biosignals, monitors displaying real-time neural readings of several subjects restrained in preparation for Phase 3. Layla's file was present, showing micro-adjustments to the serum designed to alter cognition without leaving traces. Bond initiated a controlled extraction. First, Layla. Next, the vials and critical documentation. He placed EMP devices on the lab's electronics to temporarily disrupt surveillance and automated security. A small explosion in a side corridor drew the attention of the Crescent Trust enforcers, creating a controlled diversion. They arrived fast. Armed guards, trained in lethal combat, confronted him. Bond did not hesitate. A spinning kick took one to the wall, a wrist lock converted another's momentum into a controlled takedown, and he used the monofilament garrote for the third, a single, precise motion around the neck that dropped the man silently. Every move was described with tactile detail, the physicality of combat clear and cinematic. Then, Corrin appeared, tablet in hand, trying to activate lockdown protocols. Bond leapt, knocking the tablet aside, a palm strike to the chest, then shoulder lock to the door, twisting the man into compliance. Valeska entered seconds later, pistol drawn. Bond reacted instinctively, disarming her with a sweep of the wrist, a push, then a precise strike that sent the weapon spinning across the floor. Bond secured Layla, the serum documentation, and the vials. He moved toward the stairwell. Outside, the yacht awaited, engines warm and ready. Behind them, alarms shrieked, lights strobed, the fortress now a gauntlet of response, but Bond's movements were precise, rehearsed, almost inevitable. They reached the cliff edge. Bond looked back. The manor was a hive of chaos, guards disoriented, enforcers incapacitated, automated systems jammed. The boy, now safe with Imran's local assets, waved faintly from a distance. Bond pressed the yacht into motion, carrying Layla and the critical evidence to safety. As the estate receded into the black, Valeska's final words, intercepted through a jamming device, reached him. "You've won the battle, Mr. Bond, but the war is far from over." He exhaled, eyes scanning the horizon. The crimson veil had been lifted, Hellion disrupted, the Crescent Trust exposed, but the tendrils of influence, the science turned to shadow, would haunt Europe for years to come. Bond knew it, and as the yacht cut through the waves, he felt the familiar thrill. The chase would continue, the next mission already whispering in the dark. Layla and the boy do not survive. That discovery becomes Bond's turning point. He escalates from exposing fronts to hunting the real core, Axiom Consortium, a vertically integrated organization producing the polymer scaffold and neuromodulatory payloads. The yacht's engine was a low animal in the night as Bond reached the mooring. The manor lay behind him, a smudge of broken windows and the scorched scent of things that had been burned to prevent questions. He had expected, beneath the aftermath, to find the small relief that comes with a tidy rescue, a child crying in his arms, a woman clinging and shivering with gratitude. Instead, the dock crew opened the storeroom and the world narrowed to a single impossible fact. The holding room had been cleared with grim efficiency. Blankets lay in a heap. 2 small items, a hair clip and a torn transit pass, were all that remained to mark the people who had been there. A transponder, dirted and gray, lay half-buried in a puddle of spent chemical. Q's forensics kit, when it spat its first readout, did not whine with hope. The device had been power-killed, its last log truncated by a manual hard shutdown. The last GPS fix was suspiciously close to the manor itself. That meant the killers had stayed and had made sure no trace would survive. Bond sat very still until the coffee in his cup went cold. The pattern of the night snapped from puzzle to statement. These were not sloppy abductors, these were disposal professionals. The man who ordered the abduction had not wanted witnesses. He had wanted bodies removed and evidence erased. He called Imran on a secure line. The reply was a dry, short sound. "I saw it coming," Imran said. "They do not tolerate risk. They test, they use the data, they burn the human instrument. Now they have proven how far they will go. We go deeper." Bond's eyes narrowed on the tablet. Corin's labs, Valeska's front, the manor, the island, all fronts. He had knocked down a number of nests, but nests are by design replaceable. Someone made the carrier medium. Someone else loaded the payload and gave it a tune that could alter rhythms in a living brain. The polymer lattice and its signature crosslinker were footprints that led back to manufacture. The handwriting in those footprints spelled one word on his screen: Axiom. The network revealed. Q's analysis was clinical and absolute. The lattices bore an unusual fluorinated crosslinker, not a civilian polymer but a specialist compound used in controlled release systems for defense applications. Lot numbers on requisitions traced to a legitimate facade, Gdansk Polymer Works, but the procurement log contained a hidden column of consignment codes that linked shipments to a private trust registered under a bland name, Axiom Holdings. Imran's people had pulled at other loose threads, ledger entries that showed donations through the Crescent Trust, payments laundered through offshore charities, and a string of shell companies that bought small lots of medical disposables. The network's operating model was obvious now: vertical control. Manufacture in one jurisdiction, formulation in another, then field testing at private sites where scrutiny could be suppressed with money, threats, or legal opacity. Law and ethics were obstacles that could be neutralized if you had the right ledgers and the right lawyers. "You want the head?" Imran asked. "We cut the feet first. We flip who they think are quiet. Let the paperwork bleed. Bond pinned a location on the map. Prague, a small clinic where technicians had worked odd hours and where one young lab assistant had disappeared from the payroll. We start Prague. Find the courier names. We go to Gdansk. We follow the shipment. Then we find their safe. They set the plan into motion. The Center for Integrative Neurology sat between a tobacconist and a florist, a harmless tile of a building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and lemon. Bond and a Czech field agent used a plausible official cover, a regulatory audit for medical waste compliance, to get past the polite receptionist. The clinic staff wore polite neutrality like armor. Behind the scenes a different sort of life ran: late-night clerks, refrigerated crates, and a quiet woman named Eva who moved through the backrooms with the nervous attention of someone who keeps her head down. She had been tapped at by Imran's people. They had offered her a choice: keep working and keep the silence, or speak and be given safe custody and the chance to tear a small seam in a secret. Eva's hands shook when she spoke. She produced manifests scrawled with dates and anonymous courier initials. DT-17, DT-23. She produced a list of names: drivers who came with diplomatic plates and curtain trucks, men who behaved like men who had no need to explain. She described a night routine: crates labeled imaging reagents, unloaded at 2 o'clock, paperwork stamped and backdated, and a small crew who moved vials into curtained boxes. Her voice broke on the names, but she gave Bond the one thing that mattered: a targeted address: Gdansk Polymer Works, Unit 14B, sub-basement. Bond left with more than manifests. He took Eva into protective custody. He put her under an MI6 umbrella and promised a life outside their reach if she would testify. The moment was small but seismic. A technician's confession can turn a ledger into a crime scene. Gdansk in winter looked like a shipyard that had fallen asleep. Cranes alternated their silhouettes against a gray sky, and warehouses held humidity like grudges. The Polymer Works was a tidy building with the smell of industrial solvents industriously minimized on the front steps. On paper the plant made adhesives and food-grade polymers. Off the books, beneath a secondary floor, a different business took place. Bond and Imran's operative watched for shift changes and routine routes. A diplomatic lorry with covered crates, the kind that leaves customs flustered, arrived at 1:30. The consignments were signed off to an innocuous company in Tangier. The team moved at 2 o'clock. Entry required a set of small crimes executed with surgical patience: a cut in the perimeter fence where the CCTV had a blind spot, the insertion of a small copper overlay into a sensor line to delay reporting by 90 seconds, a micro-explosive wedge into a maintenance seemed to give access without large noise. Bond's team were clean and fast, like surgeons who had been taught to kill only as a last option. Inside, the sub-basement smelled of warm resin and solvent. Stainless mixers bored into the night. A bank of vats simmered with viscous slurry. A drying room hummed with inert gas. On a bench lay a set of vials and a ledger with crosslinker lot codes that matched Q's sample from the rest area. Q's handheld returned the match in a single, bright beep. Same fluorinated backbone, same process-specific ratio of crosslinker to polymer. Bond moved through the plant with a thief's speed but a soldier's caution. He found a clipboard with a transfer slip. Core transfer pending, Northern Trust, ETA 72 hours, route code, NT27. There was also a log of diplomatic plates and a partial manifest of crates labeled sterile carriers, non-human use, an economy of euphemisms. The team collected drives and manifests, photographed mixing profiles, and exfiltrated without trace. But on the way out a private security guard, younger than his uniform, caught a glimpse. Bond reacted the way men trained to survive react, with speed. He used the man's momentum, stepped inside the guard's swing, and converted it into a hip throw that sent the man into a pallet of boxed adhesives. The throw was clean. The guard would wake with a bruised pride and the memory of being bested by something he had not understood. On the dock they pushed away in a small skiff. The drives pulsed with evidence they would bring to Q, and the manifest with the NT-27 route code screamed like a flaring beacon. The core lab was moving product and would be sealed into a site in 90 hours. Back in London, Q worked through the night. The manifests, when strung together, revealed a vertical map. Gdansk produced the polymer, Prague and Tangier handled formulation and payload loading. Private donor clinics carried the human tests, and the Northern Trust, leased through an offshore corporate veneer, owned a steel island converted into a research citadel, a place where legal pastures were thin and men could work in privacy. The name on the ledger had shifted from Helion to Axiom, a consortium of private interests, defense procurement advisors, security magnates, and philanthropic fronts. Where Helion had been a single lab, Axiom was the motherboard for an industrial machine. Bond assembled the team that would make the final move. They were a regimen of specialists, Imran's best clandestine coordinators, a Danish diver crew to handle the fjord approach, a French tactical unit for quiet entry, and Q's gadgets in a crate of humming blue metal. They had 90 hours to intercept NT-27 before the crates vanished into the Trust's core, and they had to move without the bureaucratic weight of notice. Before they left, Bond sat in a small room with Eva and the files spread like accusing leaves. He did not lie. He told her what they could and could not promise. She had given them the thread. She would be their witness. He watched her face, young, exhausted, hollowed by the knowledge of what she'd enabled simply by turning a key. "Why did you help?" he asked quietly. "Because someone has to be on the other side," she said. "Because if not me, then those girls would be forgotten." Bond closed the folder and put a jacket over his shoulders. There was no relief in the justice he sought, only the sense that doing nothing would have been worse. The northern site lay when they flew over it like an afterthought of ice and brutal engineering, an island carved to house steel, a ring of sensors, a dock with a single private mooring, and a subterranean complex beneath layers of concrete. Satellite pictures showed a facility that could have been anything: a climate observatory, a communications hub, a private research station. The reality, stitched from manifest leaks and a dozen whispered registry entries, was uglier. It was Axiom's core. They had the route code, the ETA, a shipping corridor and an entry point, a maintenance jetty described on a board log as storm control access. The plan that unfurled in the command room was a surgeon's plan. Cut the supply line before the crates were secured, insert a small team to secure the perimeter, grab the crates, render the payload inert, and, if possible, destroy the manufacturing rigs that would let Axiom rebuild. Imran's voice was a low instrument of dangerous optimism. "We strike as the shipment arrives. We move fast and we move together. No theatrics." Bond's reply was shorter: "We make it hurt enough that they cannot rebuild without the whole world knowing." They left in a small constellation of planes and boats, a weathered trawler as ghost ship, logistic support on a quiet freighter, a small formation of helicopters on standby near a NATO exercise that would provide a plausible cover. Every man carried two identities: the one he would show if they were captured, and the strings that would kill a life if that cover was breached. At the forward command, Bond checked the manifest again. NT-27. ETA. 72 hours. It was a number that felt like a countdown, not only to the arrival of crates but to the moment the world might tip either toward exposure or toward deeper secrecy. He felt the weight of Layla's hair clip in his pocket and closed his hand until it creased his palm. There would be fights to come, close, precise and dirty, betrayals to withstand, legal levers to pull after the gunpowder settled. There would be losses that would not be undone. He spoke once, to the team gathered in the low light, and his voice was simple. "We cut the head, not the skin. When they bleed, we follow the blood." Imran nodded. Q smiled with a man's professional certainty, and the others checked weapons and watches. They moved out into the cold, the cliff edge of the world folding beneath them. The sea was dark, and somewhere on it a ship carried crates labeled sterile carriers, non-human use. In 72 hours Axiom would either secure its treasure and disappear, or it would meet Bond and the team in a place designed to break the kind of things men like Axiom made. Bond set his jaw. The fight had changed. It was no longer only science and secrecy. It was a man's duty to those who could not speak for themselves. He would see the core break. If he had to burn the world to expose them, he would. The northern horizon held a thin, cold line of light. Time, for the first time since the rest area, mattered. The sky was a flat sheet of pewter when the assault team assembled on the trawler's bleeding deck. Wind licked the tarpaulin and the scent of diesel felt like a promise. Bond stood at the rail wrapped in a dark coat, the leather of his gloves creaking softly as he flexed his fingers. Around him, men checked kit, a surgical choreography of quiet violence, Q's hardware in a blue crate, Imran's satellite patch tablets, a Danish diver with ice scar hands, a French tactical pair who moved like folded knives. 72 hours, Imran had said on the plane. He now said nothing. The plan had hardened into a keen instrument. There was no room for improvisation. The manifest NT-27 had a single line in its encrypted header: priority, human redistribution. It had been a bureaucrat's euphemism for bodies. Bond had no appetite for euphemisms. They slipped toward the island under the cover of overcast noon, the trawler a smudge against the choppy water. At a mile off, the Danish team deployed small submersible drones, black, torpedo-shaped things that uncoiled like sleeping fish. The drones would live under the sonar nets and feed false signatures, coded shoals, a drifting ghost of maritime life. The main boat slowed and fell into the dark lull. Bond checked his kit: monofilament wire, silenced PPK-style pistol, an EMP emitter squeezed to a cuff, an ocular recorder at his collar. Q's compact Spectrum sniffer sat snug in a thigh holster. Imran gave him a look, a small, tight nod that meant trust and also understanding of the violence to come. They approached the jetty on rubber boats, the oars whispering. The island loomed, concrete promontories, satellite dishes like sleeping beasts, a dock with 2 crates waiting beneath a scavenged awning. Cameras lined the quay, turrets blinked domed red. The team moved as a single knife. 2 divers went under in stealth, the French pair fast-roped from a hovering helicopter to the lee of a storage shed. Bond and his small unit slipped the last 20 meters and hit the rock. The first layer of the complex's defense was simple and brutal: a ring of cameras, aerial drones on patrol, and a lattice of motion sensors tuned to mammal heat signatures. Q's field device, a wafer-thin patch that looked like a painter's palette, was glued to the underside of a camera housing and began to leak a bloom of optical noise into the sensor. For 90 seconds the sky went blind. Bond dashed across the quay. 2 guards at the entrance turned too late. Motion was the key. Strike before the network could react. He moved with the economical brutality of a man who had fought long enough to reduce perfect violence to technique. The first guard came in heavy, rifle raised. Bond used him as a pivot, a palm strike to the collarbone, a low shoulder snap that converted the man's arm momentum into a toppling arc. He caught the rifle as it fell and snapped the barrel with a gloved heel so that it would be useless. The French pair seized the gate and cut power to an outlying block. Imran's men moved toward the service airlock while the Danish divers cut an undersea cable that fed the sonar ring. The complex stuttered, lights blinking as if catching a cold. The team spread like a shadow into the facility's belly. The entry corridor smelled of ozone and cold metal. The island's interior had been carved out with disciplined cruelty: reinforced doors, airlocks into clean rooms, compartmentalized HVAC to strip particulate. Bond's throat tightened at the sight of a stainless door labeled Containment 3, Human Subjects. It was exactly the name an engineer with a conscience would avoid. They moved in small teams. Bond headed the green team, the fast infiltration pair, through maintenance ducts while Imran and the French took the south wing and the Danish divers headed to the power plant to hold generators. Q and his cyber team established an overlaid mesh to intercept internal comms, a quiet net that would tell them when and where the operators moved. Inside, the lab was clinical to the point of aesthetic cruelty. Rows of incubators hummed a soft mechanical lullaby. Small translucent chambers held bags of vials. Monitors displayed graphs with a tick that matched the entrainment frequency Bond had learnt to dread. Each panel he photographed with a tiny camera that pocketed images into an encrypting core. A soft alarm, not loud enough to be heard by the sleeping island, but a pulse in the team's ear, indicated movement. Bond pictured the night when Layla had been taken and felt that old cold knot. He moved with the economy of someone who had learned to make fear useful. A pair of technicians approached a rack, arguing quietly about calibration. Bond stepped from shadow and was in motion, a lead elbow into a sternum, a twisting wrist lock that smelled like iron, and then a coup de grace that left them bound and silent. He listened for breath, and winter-edged calm took him. None of them would die tonight unless they insisted upon it. The heart of the island was a vault below sea level. A secure door with a biometric reader looked like the entrance to a bank rather than a laboratory. Polished steel, a keypad, and the circular seal of the Northern Trust. Bond's hand worked a small contraption Q had given him, a cached biometric token emulator that could replay a fingerprint flux. For a single heart's beat it admitted him. Below, the chamber opened into a cathedral of polymer engineering. Vats the size of small cars, mixers with calibrated arms, drying ovens humming with inert gas. The air carried a faint sweet metallic tang. On a central console a monitor listed upcoming processes. Carrier bake, in progress, payload infusion, NT-27 batch A. The crates on the quay were scheduled for immediate transfer to the interior cold rooms. End of Part 1. The mission continues. Wait for Part 2.